Hi, welcome back. So now we are moving on to talk a little bit more about some of the dynamics that you might find within a work group or a work team. So I want you to think about an instance where you've been a part of a tight-knit group, whether that is something academically related, something related to a job that you've held, something related to an extracurricular group. So this tight-knit group, one where you may have expressed unified commitment to the group and shared similar beliefs that all members of the group had. And it's probably very likely that the group morale was really, really high. Like you were motivated, you were driven, you felt great about being in the group. It was a good decision. And all of these things are related to the concept of something known as cohesion. So basically, cohesion is defined as the strength of members' motivation to basically maintain membership in that particular group and of the links or bonds that will develop among members. And so cohesion has a few different major properties. So cohesion is marked both as something that is binding, a very binding force that can bring people together, but it can also be an incredibly combative force that can pull people apart. I'm sure you've seen this happen where certain tight-knit friend groups or academic groups or study groups or suites, they start out with this sense of cohesiveness and then they just flame out in these spectacular ways and fall apart. Oftentimes, cohesion is marked by a sense of group unity. Yes, I am about to say this. It's a sense of we-ness, a sense of we, group goals basically superseding and going above individual goals. There is a type of interpersonal attraction here. You can't really have a very cohesive group if you don't like the people that are in your group. So it's a very special type of almost attraction to other people in the group, and it's an aspect of teamwork. Now, cohesion can happen in a variety of different ways. It can happen because the group consists of friends who already really like each other. Maybe there is a sense of a strong sense of belonging to that group, or maybe you don't necessarily like each other all that much, but when you're all together, you work really well as a team. So cohesion can happen in a variety of different ways. So what are some of the consequences of cohesion? Cohesion, as I said, is a very strong, powerful binding force. So because of that, we will tend to find that people that are a part of a work group that has a really strong sense of cohesion do report greater job satisfaction. And because of that boost to morale, you will tend to see higher, better performance. But generally, we're going to find that as a group gets more mired in with itself, what we will often tend to find is that groupthink is going to be more likely to occur. And this was originally described by Janis in 1972. We'll spend some more time talking about groupthink, but the idea behind groupthink is that this is a case where what the group wants is more important than more realistic alternatives. And it's all about loyalty to the group, not considering other outside points of view. And it's been documented that groupthink might have had to do with some different historical decisions that had negative consequences, including the Bay of Pigs invasion, including the Challenger disaster. And I would also potentially add that some of the decisions that I think we've seen over the past couple of weeks, both might potentially, in hindsight, have also been due to a very strong pull of groupthink. So when we talk about groupthink, we often tend to focus on groupthink at a government level, but the truth of the matter is that groupthink can happen anytime that you've got a really strong cohesive group. That's true whether it's a friend group, whether it's a work group, whether it's a government group. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the dynamics of how these groups form and build over time. So odds are pretty good if you've taken other business classes or if you've taken leadership classes, you might be pretty familiar with the group development stages that were originally described by Tuckman in 1965. And of course, they rhyme up until the final one, and then it gets a little awkward. So the group development tends to occur in a very linear fashion, forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. I know it's technically adjourning, but I wanted to make it rhyme. So with forming, this is when the group members first get acquainted with each other. The interactions are going to be very polite, very tentative, very, very surface, exploratory, and unguarded. As the group gets to know each other better and becomes increasingly cohesive, people are going to start really showing their true selves. They're not going to necessarily be polite. They're going to be a lot more authentic. And that's going to lead to disagreements, conflicts, because at this point, we're not just trying to be polite. This is where we're actually getting to the real meat of the issue, and we are being our true selves, and our ideas and our thoughts are running against other people who are now more motivated to be their true selves. Once you've had these initial disagreements and conflicts, that's when a sense of unity will eventually get established. There will be increased cohesion and trust. This is probably around the stage where you will start to see group norms develop for what needs to happen next. And at that point, once you have that cohesiveness, that trust, and those group norms, there will be a greater focus on productivity and goal achievement. Now, usually adjourning can happen for a variety of different ways. Maybe this was a temporary group that was designed for a certain purpose, and now that purpose has been met. Or sometimes, as I said, really cohesive groups can fall out. Just because they're a cohesive group doesn't mean they're immune to falling apart. And so at that point, you will hit stage 5, adjourning. The roles are terminated. The relationships will potentially weaken because you're no longer needing to be together for that purpose, and experiencing some interpersonal stress might be likely. Now, there's a lot of disagreement on whether or not these stages, Tuckman kind of described this as a bit of a linear thing, but generally, like we kind of see with the 5 stages of grief, which I've also been hearing a lot about these days, these things do not necessarily have to be linear. In fact, I think your book talks a little bit about the fact that sometimes groups don't make it to these stages. So for example, if you're disagreeing and you've got so much conflict that norms never get developed, forget about focusing on performing. If you can't make it to this, if you can't make it through norming, you're not going to perform. If you never form, you'll never have an opportunity for conflict. So these don't necessarily have to be linear stages. They're often treated as linear, but I have a feeling they're much more complex than they appear on this slide. So the next concept that we're going to talk about is something called punctuated equilibrium or punctuated equilibrium. This is an alternative theory to Tuckman's model that was originally developed by Gersick in 1989. Now, when I first heard that this was called punctuated equilibrium, I was actually kind of surprised because punctuated equilibrium is a term that comes up where we talk about evolution and things like that. But the idea is kind of the same. So punctuated equilibrium in evolutionary theory is basically the idea that there are periods of stasis or that are basically punctuated by these different periods of change. And Gersick actually argued that the same is true in group formation. So rather than this linear stage model where we form, we storm, we norm, we perform, and we adjourn, here, we're going to rapidly fluctuate through different stages of development. So, for example, if you're on a group project that started at the very beginning of the semester, odds are pretty good you don't have to necessarily worry about performing until you get closer and closer to the project being due. And so Gersick basically says all of these groups do not pass through these stages one step at a time. Rather, they oscillate between stages. So maybe you're kind of in between storming and norming, storming and norming, storming and norming, and then something finally breaks that block, and then you're in the performing stage. You could potentially even go through these stages in a different sort of order. Now, the reason that he calls this a punctuated equilibrium theory is because groups will go through periods where they're just not active. And then these inactive periods are basically punctuated, get it? Punctuating that equilibrium with a spike in activity. And this will typically be due to either time or deadlines. And Gersick actually noted that you're going to see an increase in those punctuations, usually when about half of the time allotment is gone. So if you have about 2 months for a group project, usually you'll start to see people start to focus and get it together about a month before the project is due. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is social loafing. So part of the reason that I do not enjoy working in groups is because, well, I should mention that when I was younger, I was a bit of a snot. And I was like, why would I have anybody else do anything when I can do it all by myself? I'm smart. No one else is. I can do it myself. Yeah, I was a snotty kid. And I was always worried that somebody was going to slack off and take credit for my hard work. This concept of social loafing was originally developed by Ringelmann in the early 1900s. And he basically found that our individual efforts, so how hard we work, will typically decrease as a group increases in size. Now, I think this is really important. We're focusing on individual efforts. We are not talking about the group's effort. Social loafing does not really have to say anything about the group effort. And it's possible that the group effort will not necessarily increase. We're far more interested in what the individual is doing in this situation. Now, we have found this to be true for a variety of different things. So for example, if you are given headphones to listen to and there are different numbers of people clapping, the more people that are simulated to be clapping, the less loudly you clap. Think about the last time you were in a big group of people and you had to clap. You probably didn't clap that loud. But if you were in a really small class and had to clap for somebody, you're probably going to be a little bit louder. We are going to find that we are less likely to engage in social loafing and slacking off when we can be identified by our individual effort. So I do occasionally do group projects, and what I do to discourage social loafing as much as possible is I have group members evaluate each other on how much work they did. And what I generally tend to find is that most people are pretty honest if they slacked off, and they tend to be verified by other people in the group. Occasionally you will get into a 3 against 1 situation where 3 people are like, this person did nothing, and the other person's like, they lied. That is probably absolutely a case of social loafing. The other thing that we will find is that we're a lot less likely to engage in social loafing when other people are personally going to be affected by our efforts or lack thereof. Additionally, we're going to find that we're going to loaf even more if we're working on a task that we don't enjoy, or if we're not in a cohesive group. So one of the things I used to do for group projects is I was like, you're going to have to work with people that you don't like all the time or don't know. So I'm going to randomly assign you to groups. I don't do that anymore. I tend to find I get a lot less disagreements when people are allowed to work with people they like, or they get to work alone. Now, here are some other group dynamics. So one of the things that is pretty common to hear when we talk about the difference between individualistic cultures, like here in the United States, where the needs of the individual are more important or are treated as more important than the needs of the group, and collectivistic cultures, such as certain cultures in areas like China, Japan, and so on, where the needs of the group are more important than the needs of the individual, it's very, very common to hear people go, well, individualistic cultures, you're more likely to see social loafing. In collectivistic cultures, you're more likely to see what is called social enhancement or social striving. And social striving is when we tend to contribute more individually when we're part of a group compared to working alone. And so it's a very, very common trope that individualistic cultures are more prone to social loafing. Collectivistic cultures are more prone to social striving. And it turns out that that's not 100% the case. Rather than, switching up a little bit, rather than being focused on performing as well, rather than kind of focusing on the group as a whole, we tend to find that this social striving is less about doing more than other members of your group and pulling more weight than other members of your group. Rather, it's about trying to match your group members in your abilities. So it's been studied by a few researchers, this idea that collectivistic cultures are more likely to social strive, and they can be. But what's more important is they want to do just enough work to make the group look good, but they don't want to stand out. They don't want to make any one person stand out. So what you will tend to see is that the relationship between collectivistic cultures and social striving, it's more about matching everybody else's input and everybody else's abilities than doing more just because you're in a group. So it's a bit more of a complicated relationship. Some other group dynamics that we will kind of experience include things like free riding, which we generally discourage. We typically find that this is when employees don't do their fair share, but they share equally in the reward. And you'll tend to find that this is likely to happen when employees perceive that their effort is not needed for success. And generally, we'll tend to find that free riding creates what's called the sucker effect. Nobody wants to feel like they were taken advantage of by somebody who is free riding. So generally, when other members in a group feel like free riding is going on, they're going to dial down their efforts. So it's not so much social loafing, it's more of a protective effect to not be taken for, well, a free ride. So now we're going to talk about group decision making. And this was around the part where we would kind of talk a little bit about the NASA task, the stranded on the moon task. Unfortunately, like I said, I can't really present that right now, but I'd like you to think about some times where you've had to make decisions with other people as part of a group. Now, many big decisions are made by groups. Organizations and companies will have board of directors. Colleges, including Cotty College, has a board of trustees. I am technically on a board of directors for a nonprofit. Jury of peers, other groups will decide the fate of accused criminals. Usually a surgical team will decide a course of action. It's not just a unilateral decision made by one surgeon, no matter what Grey's Anatomy tries to tell you. And as such, it helps to have a really good understanding of what effective and ineffective group decision making is. So here's the basic decision making process. And we're going to go into this in more detail. Now, one thing that I will mention, every group that you ever encounter is probably going to be different from every other group you've encountered. So if you meet one group making a decision, well, congrats. You've met one group making a decision. It does not necessarily imply that other groups will make decisions the same way. But we do tend to find that even though groups make decisions in different ways, there are some pretty common steps that all groups will tend to follow. First of all, they have to diagnose a problem. They have to actually identify that there is a problem that needs to be solved. At that point, they are going to try to generate a variety of different solutions. Once those solutions have been generated, we're going to evaluate them and figure out which one will work the best. We'll choose a solution, and then finally, we're going to develop a course of action, and we're going to try to implement it. So really, this doesn't look all that different from something like a needs assessment that we talked about before. You determine that there's a need for something, you do your research, you try to look for different interventions, you select one, and then you implement it, and you see if it worked. So it's really not that different. So we're going to start by diagnosing the problem. So first of all, group members have to come to an agreement about the problem. So one of the first things we'll find, people actually have to agree that there is a problem. They also need to come to an agreement about what the goals of this whole process are and what potential obstacles there might be in their way. Now, what's kind of interesting is that this is a pretty straightforward issue. You need to identify what the problem is out loud and start thinking about what you want to do about it. But what's kind of interesting about this is despite the fact that this seems pretty straightforward and it seems really common sense, most groups spend very little time, if any at all, on this. And some pretty common pitfalls at this stage, in addition to not diagnosing the problem in the first place, you may confuse an opinion with a fact. Facts are not opinions, and you might be trying to look for scapegoats. So rather than saying, this is our problem, we need to try to fix it, somebody might be looking for someone else or something else to blame. So for example, let's say that COTI experiences something like a dip in enrollment next year. Well, that's a problem. Now, we could sit here and we could blame the situation that's currently going on right now, the economic downturn and COVID-19, and certainly those might have some responsibility, but we can't fix those things. So because of that, we need to try to avoid scapegoating and pushing responsibility onto something that we can't fix and focus on what we can. So that's one example. The next step will be to generate solutions. And this is a very discussion-oriented stage. So at this point, group members have identified a problem, they want to try to fix it, and they're going to try to process the problems and the goals that they've set for themselves while they try to identify potential solutions. Now, a pretty common way to actually do this is with a process known as brainstorming. Now, brainstorming tends to occur, and this is often recommended. All members have to generate potential solutions without criticism from other group members. Now, there's a lot of research out there that shows that brainstorming isn't always as effective as people think it is. First of all, it tends to be, usually brainstorming's kind of defined as just throw any old idea out there, it doesn't matter. But we want to make sure as much as possible that when we're brainstorming that we're actually trying to look for solutions that are relevant to the current problem. If we focus on a solution that is not relevant to the current problem, it's going to throw the group off task. So brainstorming's not necessarily the magic bullet that people tend to think it is. We do tend to find that brainstorming's a lot more effective when people can say what they feel and things like that. We tend to find that the effectiveness of brainstorming, the possibility of bad ideas is actually reduced when people have to wait their turn, if we can reduce apprehension, and if we feel like we're motivated for a good idea. Additionally, another big pitfall that you might have to watch out for here is relying on old solutions instead of trying new ideas. So it's very, very common, especially when you work at a place that has people that have worked there for a while, to say things like, well, that idea would never work. We've never done it that way. And you want to try to avoid that line of thinking as much as you possibly can.